Before we begin, I would like to know where my listeners are from. Comment down below what time is it there and if you like the video so far. It would help me a lot knowing I can make people fall asleep. Enough talking, on to the video. The 19th century is commonly imagined through softened imagery. Gas lamps, long dresses, horse carriages on wet stone streets, handwritten letters sealed with wax. This image is cosmetic. It hides the operational structure underneath. Life expectancy was short, infection was routine, pain control was primitive, power was tightly concentrated. Most people lived close to physical failure for most of their lives. For enslaved people, existence was not merely difficult. It was mechanically organized for extraction. Every law, tool, and routine was designed to convert a human body into sustained physical output until that body failed. An enslaved person had no recognized legal self, no enforceable identity, no standing in court, no bodily autonomy, no protected family bonds, no guaranteed shelter, no guaranteed food consistency, no protection from assault, no control over movement. Under law, they were not treated as a laborer. They were treated as an asset. The same century that built railroads and telegraph lines perfected large-scale human commodification. Productivity metrics were not theoretical. They were calculated through crop yield, survival thresholds, and replacement cost. Life in the 1800s was physically dangerous for almost everyone. It was statistically lethal for the enslaved. Most deaths were not dramatic. They were slow. Chronic malnutrition, untreated infection, exhaustion, exposure, tuberculosis, dysentery, childhood disease, complications from pregnancy, simple fractures turning fatal from sepsis. These were ordinary endings. The romantic version of the 1800s depends on selective memory. The operational version depended on selective visibility. This is not a story of individual cruelty. It is a system description. Slavery was not sustained by isolated violence. It was sustained by routine enforcement mechanisms operating every day for decades. Laws, patrols, debt systems, medical exclusion, family disruption, information restriction, and deliberate food control worked together as a single machine. A person could be born into enslavement without any legal pathway out. Birth itself created a new asset. That asset could be traded, leased, mortgaged, or inherited. The body was the currency. The lifespan was the depreciation schedule. Time did not belong to the person living inside it. Time belonged to the owner of the labor. The architecture of this system required one condition above all others: predictability. Predictable compliance, predictable output, predictable suppression of resistance. Everything that disrupted output was filtered out through punishment, starvation, or separation. The penalties were not always immediate. They were calibrated. Food restriction, sleep disruption, sale to a harsher region, family fragmentation. These were not emotional decisions, they were enforcement tools. Even for those not enslaved, the 1800s were structurally brutal. Industrial labor demanded 12 to 18 hours per day. Children worked in factories and mines as soon as their bodies could fit into tight spaces. Urban sanitation barely existed. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis moved faster through cities than any public health response. Fire destroyed entire city districts with no fire suppression technology. Hospitals lacked antiseptics. Surgery occurred without anesthesia well into the century. The poor rarely survived serious injury. Freedom did not guarantee safety. It only removed legal ownership. Pain was not managed. It was endured. Information traveled slowly. News of disasters, wars, and outbreaks took weeks or months to reach distant areas. Scientific correction lagged behind human damage by generations. Belief systems filled the gaps left by missing data. Superstition guided treatment. Discipline replaced diagnosis. Punishment replaced therapy. The 1800s did not operate on comfort or dignity. It operated on survival margins. For enslaved people, even survival was not the primary goal. Output was. Everything that follows in this collapse of living conditions is a consequence of that single priority. An enslaved person possessed no standing before the law. Testimony given against a white person was often inadmissible. Assault did not require restitution. Injury did not require investigation. Death rarely triggered formal review. A body could be destroyed without a legal actor being destroyed alongside it. Marriage was not a protected contract. Family bonds were not recognized as binding. Children could be sold without consent of the parents. Parents had no veto authority over the fate of their own children. Literacy was treated as a threat. In many regions, teaching an enslaved person to read was punishable by fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. Information access was treated as a form of stolen property. Written language was restricted in order to restrict imagination. Movement required permission. Travel without written authorization could be classified as theft of property rather than human relocation. Absence itself became a criminal condition. Identity required documentation. A free black person often had to carry proof of freedom at all times. Without written confirmation, capture on suspicion alone was enough to force a person into labor trafficking networks. The legal system did not operate as shared governance. It operated as a perimeter fence. Slave patrols acted as mobile enforcement units. Their function was detection, interception, and punishment. Movement after dark was treated as high-risk behavior by default. Curfews were enforced through violence. Property law overrode human injury. If an enslaved person was harmed by a third party, the legal grievance belonged to the owner, not the injured. The crime was damage to an asset, not damage to a human. Children inherited enslaved status automatically through maternal lineage. This rule ensured that sexual exploitation carried compounded economic incentives. Each birth increased inventory. Runaways were pursued not only as stolen labor, but as symbolic threats to predictability. Capture often resulted in visible punishment to reinforce deterrence across the population. Freedom itself carried risk. A free black person could be kidnapped and sold into slavery with little legal recourse in many regions. The boundary between free and enslaved was permeable and unstable. The law did not merely permit abuse, it structured it. Contracts applied to land, livestock, buildings, tools, and human beings with the same mechanical language. Depreciation was calculated. Replacement cost was estimated. Longevity was managed as part of inventory value. If a person became disabled, their legal value declined. Medical care only appeared when it protected future output. There was no concept of labor violation. There was no concept of rest rights. There was no concept of consent. Resistance existed, but its legal footprint was always defined as criminality, never as self-defense. A person's legal existence could be erased with a bill of sale. This legal vacuum shaped every daily decision. Speech was regulated. Facial expression was monitored. Silence itself could be interpreted as defiance. Compliance had to be visible. The law was not a shield, it was the blade. Work began before sunrise. Endpoints varied with season, weather, and economic demand. 12 to 16 hours of physical labor per day was not extreme, it was average. Field labor was repetitive, high strain, and heat-intensive. Crops dictated injury patterns. Cotton damaged hands and spines. Sugar cultivation produced deep cuts, crush injuries, and heat collapse. Rice fields caused parasitic disease and chronic infection. Rest was not free. Water access was supervised. Shade breaks were controlled. The body did not belong to the person using it. Caloric intake was calibrated for survival output, not recovery. Food quantity tracked productivity. Illness frequently reduced rations. Reduced rations deepened illness. Clothing was minimal. Footwear was inconsistent. Frostbite occurred in winter. Heat injury occurred in summer. Skin infections were constant. Tools were shared. Sanitation was limited. Tooth loss was common by early adulthood. Vision declined from particulate exposure. Hearing damage accumulated from constant industrial and agricultural noise. Injury did not excuse absence. Illness was interpreted as resistance unless visibly incapacitating. Even then, rest was temporary. Time was not segmented into shifts. It was segmented into durability cycles. When output slowed, replacement was cheaper than recovery. Sleep occurred in narrow windows carved between tasks. Overcrowded quarters produced light sleep, poor oxygenation, and rapid disease transmission. Respiratory illness was routine. Chronic pain was the baseline condition of adulthood. There were no long-term therapies. Alcohol and crude sedatives acted as the only relief. Addiction evolved without recognition as a disorder. Aging was accelerated. By 30, many bodies showed degeneration comparable to modern advanced age. Joint erosion, hernias, spinal compression, cardiovascular strain. Physical decline did not reduce expectations. It reduced the margin for survival. Children entered labor young. Their bones formed under stress. Growth was stunted. Injury followed them into adolescence. Mortality remained high. Pregnancy was not a shield. Labor often continued deep into gestation. Complications were common. Postpartum infections were frequently fatal. A person could collapse in the field and be worked again days later if they survived. Recovery for health was not part of the system. The objective was not longevity, it was harvest. Every day served as both a labor shift and a survival test. The failure condition was permanent. Shelter was designed for containment, not protection. Most enslaved housing consisted of crude wooden cabins with dirt floors, thin plank walls, and no insulation. Gaps between boards allowed wind, rain, insects, and rodents to pass freely. Heat escaped in winter. Moisture accumulated year-round. There was no climate control. Summer heat built to internal temperatures that matched the outdoors. Winter exposure penetrated directly into sleeping areas. Hypothermia did not require snow, it required insufficient barrier. Bedding was minimal: straw, corn husks, worn cloth. Mattresses were rare. Moisture wicked upward from the dirt floor into sleeping material. Fungal infections were constant. Respiratory illness flourished in damp air. Overcrowding was routine. Multiple adults and children sharing the same air volume produced rapid disease transmission. Isolation for sickness was rarely possible. Contagion moved unchecked. Tuberculosis thrived under these conditions. So did influenza, pneumonia, and intestinal disease. Recovery required rest. Rest was structurally unavailable. Sleep occurred in compressed intervals. Work schedules began before sunrise. Domestic labor extended after field labor ended. Childcare overlapped with physical exhaustion. Full REM cycles were chronically disrupted. Sleep deprivation became a permanent condition. Cognitive fatigue accumulated. Reaction time slowed. Injury risk climbed. The system absorbed the losses. Sanitation infrastructure did not exist. Human waste disposal was makeshift. Water runoff contaminated drinking sources. Latrines leaked into shared soil. Flies moved freely between waste and food. Rats nested inside walls. Mice infested stored grain. Lice, fleas, and ticks moved between bodies with no containment strategy. Vector-borne disease circulated without interruption. Skin infections became systemic. A cut became a fever. A fever became organ failure. There was no concept of isolation medicine. Children slept in the same conditions. Their immune systems formed under constant microbial pressure. Survival required early hardening. Many did not survive long enough to adapt. Fire risk remained constant. Open flames provided light and heat. Chimneys were crude. Fires spread rapidly through wooden clusters. Entire quarters disappeared overnight. Reconstruction of shelter was immediate. Recovery time was irrelevant. Loss did not pause labor. Housing did not evolve to protect the body. It evolved to store it between labor cycles. The absence of controlled rest meant that physical degeneration accelerated. Repair mechanisms malfunctioned under chronic fatigue. Musculoskeletal injuries never fully healed. Respiratory capacity declined early. Home did not function as a recovery environment. It functioned as a staging area between endurance events.
Diet was monotonic by design. Cornmeal formed the caloric base. Salt pork provided inconsistent protein. Molasses served as supplemental sugar. Vegetables appeared irregularly and seasonally. Micronutrient deficiency was widespread. Vitamin loss produced scurvy, neurological impairment, immune suppression, and developmental disorders. These conditions were rarely identified. They were labeled as weakness. Water quality varied with weather and location. Wells were shallow. Surface runoff contaminated supplies. Bacterial load fluctuated predictably after rain. Hunger functioned as both condition and control mechanism. Rations were tied to productivity. Output fell, calories fell. Illness reduced food access. Reduced food access worsened illness. Starvation did not always appear as absence of food. It appeared as chronic insufficiency that slowly stripped muscle, suppressed immunity, and stalled growth. Children suffered the most. Growth curves flattened early. Bone density declined. Puberty delayed or advanced erratically. Mortality before adulthood remained high. Food theft carried extreme risk. Punishment escalated quickly when rations were taken outside authorized channels. Hunger did not mitigate enforcement. Protein cycles followed harvest profits. Economic downturns immediately affected food volume. There was no buffer system. There was no reserve for human need. Pregnant women did not receive nutritional increases as a standard. Fetal development competed directly with maternal survival. Stillbirths and infant death followed predictably. Heat stress compounded caloric deficits. Summer labor burned more energy than winter labor. Rations did not scale to metabolic demand. Dehydration was common during peak harvest periods. Water breaks were supervised. The fear of slowed output outweighed the risk of collapse. Malnutrition reshaped the body. Edema developed in the legs. Hair thinned. Teeth loosened. Vision declined. Cognitive processing slowed. Food was not selected for health. It was selected for storage life, cost efficiency, and labor sustainability until replacement. Starvation was not failure of the system. It was part of its pressure profile. Medical access was not universal. Enslaved people received treatment when the potential return on recovery exceeded the perceived cost. Care was an investment decision. Professional physicians were summoned selectively. Minor injuries were handled with crude field remedies. Many conditions were ignored entirely. Surgery often occurred without anesthesia prior to mid-century adoption. Amputations were performed to prevent gangrene, not to preserve function. Survival depended on infection avoidance, which was poorly understood. Antiseptic techniques did not yet exist. Blood-borne pathogens passed freely through reused instruments.
A successful procedure could still result in fatal sepsis days later. Chronic pain had no treatment pathway. Opioids existed but were not distributed for long-term relief in enslaved populations. Alcohol functioned as the dominant analgesic. Mental trauma was not recognized as injury. Dissociation, depression, panic, and cognitive withdrawal were interpreted as behavioral defects. Pregnancy carried extreme risk. Obstetric knowledge was limited. Hemorrhage and puerperal infection killed thousands. Maternal death did not disrupt labor scheduling for the remaining population. Physicians sometimes used enslaved bodies as experimental material. Consent was not required. Surgical techniques were refined through human trial without anesthesia or refusal rights. Autopsy followed death with little ritual or restraint in some regions. The body remained an object after terminal failure. Medicine did not operate to preserve dignity. It operated to prolong usable capacity. Disability reduced legal value. A disabled enslaved person faced resale into harsher labor markets or abandonment. Care was not guaranteed after physical decline. Blindness, lameness, and chronic disease narrowed survival chances. Work assignments shifted toward lower output tasks until output disappeared entirely. Medical science advanced during this century. The benefits were distributed unevenly. Protective knowledge reached enslaved populations last. Pain was normalized. Suffering was unremarkable. Silence became the default expression of injury.
Sexual access to enslaved women was structurally unpoliced. Legal systems rarely recognized assault across racial boundaries. Children produced through coercion inherited enslaved status automatically. This created a self-reproducing labor system. Birth increased inventory. Pregnancy did not interrupt labor expectations. Family units were not legally binding. Partnerships existed socially, not contractually. Sale dissolved families instantly. Distance erased contact permanently. Children were separated early for training, labor, or sale. Parents had no enforceable claim. Emotional bonds carried no legal weight. The threat of separation functioned as an enforcement tool. Compliance preserved proximity. Resistance triggered dispersal. Emotional trauma accumulated across generations without relief or recognition. Grief cycles repeated without closure. Reproductive control belonged to owners. Forced breeding occurred in some regions through pairing policies. Reproductive choice did not exist as a concept. Infant mortality remained high. Loss compounded without recovery periods. The family was not an institution. It was a vulnerability. Thank you for tuning in to the video. If you are still awake by then, comment what was your favorite part, and if you liked the video, please do subscribe. Until next time.